There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean Breathes Books. Welcome back to my channel and another Freddy Reads. This is indoors. It's a rainy day. We really need the rain in Saskatchewan. It's supposed to rain for 3 days. I hope that's true. I've had a quiet, good week. Had to replace the washing machine, so that just got installed. And only one of the installation dudes was cute, and Kenji didn't agree that he was cute, but I thought he was, and that's about as exciting of a week as it's been. So without further ado, I have a very exciting mystery guest for you. And this week's mystery guest is the Vietnamese-Canadian writer and educator Vinh Nguyen, joining us from Toronto, here to talk about his very recently published memoir, The Migrant Rain Falls in Reverse. And we're sure going to get into what that title's all about. Welcome, Vinh.
Hi, Sean. Thank you for having me.
It's so lovely to meet you. And yeah, your bio is about 2.5 pages long, and it's very impressive. Tell us about this memoir.
Yeah, Migrant Rain Falls in Reverse is a memoir about family history, about personal desire and reckoning with the past. So I call it a speculative memoir. The book centers on my father's disappearance while he's seeking refuge, and then it moves forwards with me trying to discover answers and trying to come to terms with that past. So the book begins with the memories that I have of him, of our past. It's the memories that my family members have. And then as memory reaches its limits, right? These memories are all constructions anyways. And as they reach their limits in terms of what they can really do, I begin to rely on speculation. So I move into the what could have beens, what I wanted to have happened, what should have happened. And so the book is really centered on this speculative desire. It's trying to create stories about the past, present, and future in a way that allows for desire to be explored and fulfilled.
Just sounds fascinating. If it's okay, tell us a bit more about the opening. I don't know where the story opens, but the blurb talks about the fall of Saigon, and tell us a bit more about where your family was in all of that.
The book itself actually opens with me wanting to return to the refugee camp in Thailand that my family and I spent 3 years in. And so it's trying to rediscover this other place. But the fall of Saigon and the Vietnam War is the kind of structuring force, right? It's the history for this family history of ours. And so I wasn't born yet during,
I was going to say,
but in some ways, that's when my story also began. So after the fall of Saigon and the end of the Vietnam War, my father was imprisoned for about 8 years in re-education camps. And so my mother had to take care of my 3 older siblings in post-war Vietnam. And when he was released was when I was born in 1982. And a few years after that was when we had to flee the country. And this is a story about the enduring legacies of war, right? Even when we arrive in Canada, the war is a part of our story.
You make a journey not just on the page, but literally you go back. And you've already mentioned you going back to the refugee camp, or where the refugee camp had been in Thailand. Tell us more about that trek, that quest that involved traveling back to Asia.
Yeah, absolutely. So this book is really, I think, a book about returns, right? And the desire for return, the desire for the past. And I think for me, it's not necessarily the returns are less interesting than the desire for those returns. What is the kind of the emotional work that's being done when we want to return? Because, of course, the past is unreturnable and things are not there for us to come back to.
I always think of Gertrude Stein when she went back to her hometown, was it Los Angeles or something? And she said, there's no there.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And it doesn't have the kind of significance that we kind of place upon it. And so I can return to the refugee camp, but part of what I see and part of what happened there was that it's now dirt roads occupied by other people and other lives. Other histories have paved themselves over this place that has stayed static in my mind. and in my own desire, right? And thinking about returns not just as physical things, but there are these emotional and psychic returns that we constantly try to do, that we create in our psyches. That's part of what the book is trying to explore, is not just the physical returns, but the desires for returns and what they can do. Yeah.
Okay, I can't go another second longer without asking you, what an incredible title. The Migrant Rain Falls in Reverse. And maybe it's a spoiler to explain it, but if it isn't, I'm so curious about this title.
Definitely, yeah. When I was doing this book, I wanted a title that would stop people, at least for a second or two, to ask, what is this? What does this mean? What's going on here? And it's a bit abstract, and it's not a straightforward title, but it's up for interpretation. I think a lot of people have actually written to me, or I've talked to people at events where they're like, oh, I really love the title, and this is what I think it means. And as I'm reading the book, I'm getting the significance of what it means to fall, right? Or what the rain is doing in your book, and what it means to fall in reverse, and all of these things. But probably the most interesting interpretation of it comes from my mother, actually, because she had the same question, right? This one day we were in a car and she said, why is this book called The Migrant Rain in Reverse? And so I turned the question back to her and I said, what do you think, Mom? She took a few moments and she said, I think it's the tears of migrants. Of it's the tears that fall inside migrants who can't return to where they came from. And so it's this sort of internal emotion, right? This emotion that people who've been displaced have, or the tear that they shed for themselves, maybe not in front of others, but in their own sort of small, quiet moments. And I just thought that was such a sort of beautiful, poetic interpretation of the book. And to me, that's the interpretation that matters. And that's the one that I'm going with. And the migrant rain falls in reverse are the tears of migrants who long for return and who can't.
That's beautiful. You've already characterized this as a speculative memoir, and the jacket copy says part fractured reminiscence, part invented history, and part fictional fabulation. I'm interested in how this became that kind of a book. Simplistically, I would imagine you got to a certain point where you realized you weren't going to find the facts to create a standard memoir, but I'd like to hear more about how all that came to be. It's fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think for somebody like myself and writing the kind of story that I was trying to write, which is a story of unknowns, right? A story of questions, stories of gaps and missing pieces, a story of fractured lives and histories. I think what I experienced was that as I was writing, I kept on hitting a wall. And in some ways, I felt like I was writing towards the same location over and over again. And in some ways, I was writing the same thing over and over again. And that the story, in some ways, couldn't move forward. I was hitting these walls of unknowns, right? These walls of uncertainties. And so I think for me, the pivot of this book was when I realized that in order to drive this story forward, in order to move beyond the place where I was stuck, I had to move into the realm of fiction. I had to move into the realm of speculation. I had to open up the story towards the counterfactual. And I think in doing so, I allowed my story to become fuller, to expand in a way that is beyond the individual and beyond me, right? So I think speculation and fiction allowed me to bring in other stories and other voices. So one of the things that I did in this book was to write a counterfactual history of my father's life. So what would it have been like had he not died, had he not disappeared? And in order to put that life together, I had to cobble together the lives of refugee men who did live, the kinds of histories that did unfold, not for my father, but for men like him, in order to graft together a story of his life and how that life speaks to a larger history of the Vietnamese diaspora.
You are a academic, a professor of English at the University of Waterloo.
Yes.
And you have done an incredible amount of academic work focused on refugee studies, refugee narratives.
Yes.
And I'm assuming that a lot of that, or most of that, maybe all of that, preceded the writing of The Migrant Rain Falls in Reverse. What was the process like finding a more personal, non-academic voice in this?
Yeah, I think that was what I was so afraid of. I think my biggest fear as I was writing this book, this memoir, was to say, oh my God, is the academic kind of rearing his head? Is that academic voice overtaking the personal voice? Because part of the genesis of this book was that I had finished writing my academic book, and it was such a hard process where I really began to hate writing, actually, to be very honest. It was such an arduous, difficult process that I felt like I didn't want to write anymore. And the creative writing was a way for me to bring myself back to words, to get a different flavor, to get a different taste. And so for me, I couldn't have written this book without first writing the academic book and all the academic research that I did, because I think in some ways, part of the research that I did allowed me to understand what I didn't want to do, right? It allowed me to understand the kinds of demands and expectations that are placed upon refugee voices and refugee lives, the kinds of conventions that we're supposed to follow. And I really had a good sense. I didn't know what I was doing, but I had a really good sense of, okay, I'm not doing this, and I'm going to try to buckle the stereotype or not fulfill these kinds of demands or expectations. There's so much about refugee stories that demands a transparent confessional voice, a story of truth telling. And so much of this book is about an unreliability. It's a memoir that's unreliable, that calls into question memories and stories and lives and flips all of those things on their heads, right? Or at least that's what I hope it does. I wanted to write a book that wasn't a transparent confession of a life story. I wanted this book to be playful. Part of the content of the book is quite serious, but I think what I do with storytelling is playful and hopefully also at times funny.
Speaking of playful, my viewers who know my personality fairly well, so they won't be too shocked, but I want them to know that I have pre-cleared this rather flippant question with, Vin, how gay is this book?
It's a completely gay book. It comes from me, and so it has no other choice but to be gay. And I think there is this narrative of queerness that runs through, even when I'm not speaking about queerness, there's a strand, there's a thread about living a queer life that runs throughout every single chapter of this book. There is one chapter that's specifically focused on queerness, and it's a chapter that I think tries to do a lot because it begins with a very conventional thing. It's a coming out narrative in that chapter. But what I wanted to do with that narrative was to also talk about the relationship between desire and violence. So, in a story about war, right, in a narrative, in a whole book that is premised on a war, it's also the most violent narrative. And you'll have to read to figure out what I mean by that. But part of that violence is also juxtaposed with the relationship between myself and my mother. So it's also the most tender chapter, I think, in the book. So it's trying to do a lot. I don't know if it does all of that kind of stuff, but in my head, what I wanted to do with that chapter, a chapter that begins with a coming out narrative, was to explore racialized violence and a kind of motherly, unconditional love that is also a part of that. Yes, very gay. The gayest.
Sounds amazing. I can't wait to read it, and I'd love to have you come back and chat more in depth
Yes,
once I have
absolutely.
apps.
I hope
Yeah.
so. Yeah.
What are you working on now, Vin?
So I am working on a novel.
Great.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm trying my hand at fiction, and it's a queer romance set at the end of the Vietnam War and also 20 years after the war, which is when Vietnam has its own perestroika. It opens up its modernization. A lot of the Vietnam War books are, in some ways, masculinist in orientation. And so I wanted to write a kind of queer historical romance that takes place during the war. And I am very excited about it.
That's fascinating as well. I think you have some books to recommend. I'm very curious to see what kind of a reader you are as well.
I do. I have two books to recommend. The first is a book called Strange Weather in Tokyo by Hiromi Kawakami, published by Counterpoint Press, which is the press that published my book in the US. The translator is Allison Markin Powell. And it's absolutely fabulous. I'm a huge fan of contemporary Japanese fiction. I think some of the most interesting stuff being published right now is coming from contemporary Japanese, women Japanese writers as well, right? Because I think they're doing such a fabulous job of portraying and analyzing and critiquing Japanese society. But this book is an unconventional romance. It's an incredible book about a woman who runs into her former high school teacher. And then they begin this incredible relationship. And it's written in such precise, but also floating prose, right? There's so much that's gestured to, there's so much that's layered into every single interaction, every single sentence. And so it's precise, but it's also at the same time ungraspable. And yeah, that's all I'll say about this, in that the writing is just absolutely incredible. What I love about contemporary Japanese writing, and what I love specifically about Kawakami, is that with the writing, you're reading and you're saying, okay, all of this is fine. I understand everything. Nothing is too deep or magical. And then as you're reading and as the story and the sentences and the writing is building, it just hits you in the most unexpected way, this incredible insight, right? Your entire perspective is shifted and changed in the most seemingly simple way. And there's so much that Kawakami's writing does that's like that. And so
You certainly make me interested to give it a try, give it another try. I didn't click with it years ago and put it aside, but you
okay.
make me want to try it again. And I've always loved the photograph on the cover.
I know it's such an incredible cover and it's such a gorgeous title as well. So
Another one, maybe the next one is called the Nakano Thrift Store or something.
yes, the
And
Nakano.
I don't know if you know that I lived in Tokyo for 13 years and I lived very near Nakano. So,
Oh,
yeah.
amazing. I lived in Tokyo for 2 years.
Oh,
So
when?
yeah, I taught it, when was this? 2005.
Before me.
Yeah, I taught English there for 2 years. It was
Okay.
such
Yeah. I taught there for 13
incredible,
years.
incredible time. Okay, so we'll have to chat about that at some other point.
Absolutely. I landed a Japanese husband. How about you?
No, I don't have a Japanese husband yet.
Yes.
Yeah,
Pride Month is just getting started. Who knows what
yeah,
might happen?
yeah. I love that book. And then a writer who I'm just obsessed with right now is Bryan Washington.
Yes.
And so I'm going to recommend Memorial.
And is that his first novel? I think he
This
came
is
out
the
with
first
short
novel.
stories first,
Yes,
and then
Lot is the first short story collection, which is also absolutely incredible. But Memorial, another unconventional love story, right?
yes,
And I think just brilliant. I think he's just the most exciting writer alive right now, to me, anyways.
that's wonderful. You saw me looking around. I'm in the middle of editing a book haul video. I don't know if you know what that is. Do you know what
Mm-mm.
a book haul is? Here are the books I bought.
Yeah,
Here's the new books. And I
yeah.
have that one and his second novel that I'm just
Family meal.
Family Meal that I'm just literally editing that part of the video. And
Yeah.
his books were very strongly recommended to me by the author of one of my favorite queer books, a gay black British writer, Elvin James Mensah. And his
Oh,
book is
I've never heard of him.
Small Toys, and he worships Bryan Washington as well.
Oh, yeah. Memorial is just brilliant. That's all I can say about it. There's so much rawness. And Bryan Washington is so good at writing the things that are not said, the things that are not there. And what's really great about this, so it's a story about a gay black man who lives in Houston and he has a Japanese boyfriend.
That's right. Yeah.
And the Japanese boyfriend takes off to Japan to go look for his father, while his Japanese mother moves into the apartment with his black partner. And so that relationship between the stranger, this Japanese woman, and this black man is fantastic. It's so wonderfully written. And Washington writes about this Japanese mother so well. He writes about food, he writes about family, he writes about queerness, he writes about the complexities of the ways in which we love and hurt. And what else can you ask for?
That's right.
Read anything by Bryan Washington.
I've got them on my shelf. I must get to them.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Those
yeah.
are great recommendations. What a wonderful chat this has been, Vin. I hope it's the first of, that'd be a little greedy to say many, but I get to
Well, I
have.
will chat with you anytime.
Looks like we got some things to chat about online or offline as well.
Yes, yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sean.
I was struck by Vinh Nguyen's comments about the pressure that refugee writers feel to adopt a confessional tone and what kind of a memoir this might be in very consciously subverting that. That was fascinating, as well as the way he described why the books he recommended spoke to him. Fascinating, beautiful use of language in describing how the books affected him. He said Bryan Washington was good at writing the things that are not said, that are not there. And that's a very interesting comment, something I'm going to think about. Do I ever notice that about writing I admire? This is, I think, available as an audiobook too, if you want to check it out. Editing Sean here. While I was a little sleepy, I guess, because I skipped right over the week in review and a couple other things that I usually mention in a Friday read. So, the week in review, I did manage to post the queerest of gay pride book haul videos a couple days ago. A whole swack of mostly very recently published LGBTQ plus books. Check that out. Also, on Patreon, next week is the book club discussion for During the Reign of the Queen of Persia. I don't have the book in front of me. I think that's the title of the novel by Joan Chase. So if you join my Patreon and start reading the book, it's not that long, maybe 200 and some pages. You could take part in that next Saturday. And I've just put a poll up today on Patreon to vote on the September book club read. And those titles that we're voting on are all non-fiction, many of them about nature and the environment, but not exclusively. So join soon enough to vote on those and take part in that book club chat. There, that's what I forgot to say. I have not finished any books, so this will be a very short Friday reads. I will check in, however, haphazardly on the 2 books I started last week. I think I only started 2. And then I'm going to tell you about one I'm starting in the coming week. So I'm now a ways into volume 5 of the Unselected Journals of Emma M. Lyon by Beth Brower. Enjoying it just as much as the others. In fact, I'm about a third of the way through it because I read several. It's obviously the Unselected Journals. It's journal entries for every day. Some of them are very short, some of them are longer. They're all funny, and there's a darkness or a seriousness to the story that really began to take hold of the narrative in volume 4 that's continuing, and I'm just beguiled by them. One of the things that I love that she does, has done this since the first volume, because it's in the form of a diary or journal. Emma will start to write what she should say, and then she crosses it out, and we get all that strike through and replacement in the text. Let me give you an example. For example, here is a man that she doesn't much like and that doesn't much like her. Mr. Harper came up the stairs. He welcomed, then welcomed is struck through. He greeted, and greeted is struck through, and then he acknowledged me, and the sentence continues. I love that little writing tick. It's very effective. I am not sure yet what to say about Louise Erdrich's The Mighty Red. I'm enjoying it. It's very different. It's about young people. And I'm not yet sure that there's enough character work to pull off the novel. I'm mostly amused by these young kids. The 2 men are complete dolts. And the young woman, whose hand is being sought in marriage by both of these doltish young men in the town, in, I think, North Dakota, she has a lot of things going for her, and I don't know how much of this is the magic of the audio narrator, but the voice of this character, this young woman, her wit and she does not suffer fools gladly, yet she is, I think, deeply sexually attracted to both of these fools, and she's always putting them down in the most delicious, biting ways that go right over their heads, and that's probably the part I'm enjoying the most. She is a part Indigenous, and that's all I can really say. I'm certainly enjoying it. I don't know where it's going or what's going to happen. So, that is a pretty messy check-in on the first maybe hour of it. And finally, I'm going to be starting a novel because this novel had been one of the books that's been sitting on Jo Smith's shelf the longest. And she said that this year she was going to try to get to some of those books. This was one, and I said, let's buddy read it. And it is a Scottish novel, A Disaffection by James Kelman. I haven't read his famous, was it Booker Prize winning, How Late It Was, How Late. And this is an earlier one, I assume. He's a Glaswegian writer, and this was published in '89. It's about working class Glaswegians, and I don't want to know another damn thing about it. I'll give you more of a preliminary check-in when I'm ready to do so. That's my Friday Reads. Short and sweet, I hope. Thanks for watching.